Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and this episode marks a special moment for Finders Keepers because we have our first guest. That's right, you don't have to just listen to me on this episode. We've got someone who you would have heard him on the coaches panel over the years, and I've had the privilege of sharing the mic with him from time to time. Someone who knows a lot about keeper leagues. It's Kane. G'day, mate. Welcome to Finders Keepers.
Thank you, Jordox. Very happy for you, mate, to have your own platform, and very happy to have another platform talking about keepers because you know how much I love them. And it's nice to hear that the listeners love them too. We get a lot of good feedback, a lot of people asking for this content. So good on you for stepping up and giving the people what they want.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, it's been good fun so far. So today's episode, we're going to talk a bit about strategy and the different strategies that you can have for a keeper league. Things to think about, certainly as we approach season 2025. And as an added bonus, towards the end, we're going to start looking at rookies. And not only do I have the great Kane's mind to cast his eye, I've actually got my hands on the ADPs, so the average draft positions for the rookies taken in the redraft so far on the new league, the new platform, Keeper Fantasy. So we'll go through the rookies at the end, but to start with, Kane, those who've been following Coaches Panel for a long time will know your voice and know you pretty well, but I want to hear about your background with keeper leagues and how you fell in love with them, much like the rest of us.
Well, it's funny, Jordox. I probably fell in love with them before I knew what the format was. I just always loved DT. That was my first love, DT and Supercoach for, over 15 years now. But I always loved the projection side. So I probably didn't even know the format existed until I actually went on Big Footy. I loved reading the forums, especially back in the day, trying to get any news on players. But there was a forum that people were actually doing a keeper league on the forum. They had the league set up and they'd tell you their trades. They'd tell you who they'd redrafted, and I was like, I just wanted to be part of this, but it never eventuated until about 15 years ago when I took over from an existing team. So we ended up having two coaches leave the league. MJ's in that league, and two people got brought in. We actually had a mini draft. So we put those two teams into a pool, and we alternated picks taking their players. And the first player I ever got in a keeper was Tom Mitchell. Would you believe?
Oh.
So that was my first.
Excellent.
That was my first building blocks. It was a bit of a weird way to get into keeper, that it wasn't sort of the whole pool of guys to select. In COVID, that's when MJ and I started a league with a couple of the Patreons to get them through COVID. We're having fun doing redrafts, and I think the format's just exploded the last 5 years. Jordox, obviously, technology platforms like Keeper have made it way, way easier. I know in the past, you'd sort of use a draft website, and then a lot of the bookkeeping would have to be done, via a Google Doc or Excel. And, did you submit your trade and update the draft pick? So it became pretty hard for commissioners, as you know, as well. So to have a platform like Keeper now that tracks all that, I feel like we're going to see the boom of the format, because for me, it's the most rewarding format by far, because when you nail that projection, when you pick that player and you believe in them and you're right, we just never let them go, right? And if you are struggling on the flip side, it's really rewarding to tear it down and start afresh and build. So for me, it's the best format by far. I love it. I think it's got a nice balance of the off season's actually really important too. Whereas we know often in the salary cap, especially now with opening round, Jordox, you can sort of park it, see opening round, and then just build a team in a day, and you're actually almost just as well off as the people that have sort of worked tirelessly. So that's how I got it. That's how I got involved. And yeah, mate, I just love the format.
Yeah, no, I think everyone that's listening would agree with all that. And even what you said about, when you get a guy and that projection turns out, there's nothing more satisfying than plucking someone from obscurity, and then a few years down the track, he's a primo that people are investing in the salary cap formats. It's just, you just feel proud of them, don't you?
Oh, 100%. And that's the exciting part, is not only the projection, but sometimes the way you get that player. Like sometimes they're just thrown in the deal. There's so much collaboration in a way in keeper leagues that, like the AFL, there's naturally teams that feel like they're going to win the thing this year. There's some teams that are a bit younger and and building up. So you can get these sort of collaborative trades where you've got someone going all in and you're getting a young player. And yeah, it's a bit scary as, looking back and going, how did we let this player go for so cheap, but now they're a star? Or conversely, and this is what keeps me and MJ up all the time in the off season, how quickly the studs can just completely fall away within a year and go from being some of the best players in the comp to almost unfieldable and out of your league.
That's right. And you mentioned MJ, who's obviously the main man over at Coaches Panel, does a mountain of work, particularly in the preseason. Now, one of my favourite things that Coaches Panel do is, it's for the Patreons only, but it is the Coaches Panel Keeper Ranks. And it's been going for 5 years now, I think. And what it is MJ and Kane come together, put their heads together and come up with the 50 best prospects for a keeper league, for a new keeper league. I love it. It's my favourite series to listen to every year, pretty much just because when I hear one of you guys mention a player I own, I just, feel that pride all over again. So tell me, for those who do listen and know the series well, how do you and MJ come up with these tiers? What are you looking for in these players to get them into that 50? And what's your process?
I think the good thing that me and MJ do, and the nice thing, Jordox, about it is we do sort of start it in September. It's a nice piece of content that we sort of drip fed out over the off season. That's a pretty busy time for me work-wise. So it's a good thing to sort of just chip away at. And how we start is we don't like to talk to each other about it at all. So I'll go through and pick out just sort of my, I guess, big list per se. So I just like starting club by club. I'll just go club by club. And if there's a guy I feel like they're close, sort of in that maybe top 75, 80 players, I'll put them in. And obviously some clubs have 7 or 8 of these guys that fall into that consideration. Others have 2 or 3. So I just start with a big list. And then naturally you just start going through who are the ones that, are more or less locks, who's fighting for the last few spots. I try to put them in a bit of a rough order. I'm not too bothered. It's more just trying to get that cut down. So I sort of send MJ about 70 names that I sort of think would warrant it, depending on the conversation. And you as a listener know, that's probably the thing that MJ and I always mention is there's the contenders list, which would be more of a single season list. And then there's the future list where some of those young guys, you really do have to wait more because it can turn. So we start with the big list. MJ sends me his list. We sort of collate them together and then we end up just knocking a few names out to get it to the 50. And then we start knuckling down on the tiers. So for us this year, I'll give it away now because it's gone out for a little while, but we sort of found the top tier was pretty easy. We just had Dacos, Sheasel and Goulden, just that combination of age and scoring power. So once we start doing that, you sort of start finding similar players, whether they're similar in age and scoring. They often obviously get grouped together naturally. There's some guys that have some durability issues. There's some guys that have advantageous positions for this year that we maybe don't think will have that going forward when we project. Some of the guys we have a bit more confidence that they might retain that advantageous position, such as a Dylan Moore, for example. Obviously gets a nice weighting, been a long-term forward that can push 90. We just start chipping away at it, Jordox, just conversations. And sometimes that's the thing, as we always say with keepers, is we have to draw a line and be locked into it because we would have 100% upgraded Will Ashcroft to a different tier if we hadn't locked in the list, at the end of August. Seeing what we saw in September when he really got going with his body, that's what we always say is the fun of keepers is we always want to update it. And reality is it's a stock market really, isn't it? As information comes to hand, we update, particularly through that October period as we see trades go through. And then obviously more into November when we see the draftees trying to sort of read where maybe the club think they're lacking or if they're trying to future-proof a position. So it starts off sort of siloed. We just don't want to be influenced by each other and sort of take that shortcut. And we do naturally disagree on players as well and sort of have to find a common ground, I say, where, I might be really bullish on a guy inside the top 20. MJ's got him more in the 30s or 40s. And we try to find that middle ground. So it's a really fun exercise. I think what we also like about starting fresh is, and MJ always mentions this on the podcast, he tells you where they were the year before. And I think every year that blows us away how much change there is in a keeper. Because I feel like this time of year, you're looking at your side and you're going, this guy's going to be a 5-year premium defender for me. This guy's going to be a 10-year mid. but we're just always amazed that this stuff changes quick. Some guys go from out of the 50, go from in the top two tiers to out of the 50.
Yeah, it's interesting, the change, like you said, because there's players who, I can't think of an example, but you'll have a player who's been there for a few years, and when you first put him in the list, you're probably expecting that, yeah, he just keep going all the way up to tier one.
I'll tell you who that is, Jordox.
Sometimes
Alex Witherden. Alex Witherden was a guy that when he came into the system, obviously he played a little bit in the back end of his first year, and the scoring was incredible off the bat. And obviously that sort of, that catches your eye a bit. We hadn't done the 50 at this point, but it's just a great example. So, obviously you watch him next year and he's backed it up again, and you're thinking, gee whiz, this is a guy that's 20 years old. He's nudging 90. Even just saying he holds that, if he gives you 10 years of service at a 90, it's like back in the day of Corey Enright. Yeah. Like you just got this guy that perennially is a 90, lock him in as a defender. I would think if we were doing the current system, he's probably on a similar trajectory to a sort of Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller, who MJ and I absolutely love. Like just at the comparable age and the scoring, while not quite Naz's level, it's really, really good. So he probably would have peaked for us. I'd say he'd be close to a top 30, 35 prospect. And then unfortunately, as time goes on and things changed at Brisbane, teams sort of started picking on him really from a defensive point of view, and some of that ball use as they improved as a team and started surging up the ladder. The ball wasn't living in defence, and they didn't want to move the ball the way, Witherden naturally played. So he gets traded to West Coast, and maybe that gives him a little spike as people think he might settle back into that role. But you look at him now, and you've got no confidence that he even plays in a team, like West Coast that's perennially been in the bottom few sides. So that can be the issue.
Yeah, and even when he went to West Coast, he, you thought when Shannon Hearn left, but didn't work out for him, and he's no longer on the list. So as you said, things do change very quickly. That's really good, mate. Like I could talk to you about that series all day. It's one of my favourites. So certainly for those listening, if you haven't checked it out, Coaches Panel, join up to the Patreon there, and you'll be getting access to that every year in the off season.
There's at least 8 hours there, Jordox, as you know.
So
there's 8 podcasts of a minimum an hour.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's great listening. So what I want to do now, Kane, we'll just moving on to some other topics. So I put the question out to the listeners, sort of early days finders keepers a few weeks ago, and got some great responses that I thought could spark some conversations for us today. So the first one comes from @the Draft Bible on X. Now, Draft Bible is actually a pretty new account. They've actually put together a draft kit, but a different sort of one to what you'd expect. So the draft kit is usually about players and rankings. This Draft Bible is about strategy and how to absolutely prepare. So it's for a single season draft, so it's not keepers or dynasty, but certainly check them out @the Draft Bible on X, doing great stuff there. And the question, Kane, and I'll put it to you, is about contending or rebuilding. It's such a big question for Keeper League coaches. So I guess the question is, how do you know when your team is in contention? Obviously, if you've just played at a grand final, but is this something you need to know before your redraft, or can it depend sort of greatly on who you're able to draft? How do you see the swings between contending and rebuilding? Because it depends on the size of the league, I suppose, but I'm in a league where I feel like anyone can contend almost any year because it's that open and that wide. How do you see it in terms of
that's a really good question, because I think it does. I think it does depend, because as you said, the less keepers you get to keep year on year, naturally the more talent there is in the redraft pool. And obviously the more talent there is in the redraft pool, the quicker you can probably turn that side around. So that's probably the main thing. If you're keeping sort of 15, 20, that's when you can have a really good understanding of, okay, who are the teams that are real contenders? Because, if you're only keeping 6 to 8, which is probably about as small as you'd consider a keeper league would go, you lose a couple of injuries to those top 6 or 8 that you've kept. One guy just regresses slightly anyway. A couple of guys in other teams come on. I think that's where it's really hard to predict. But if you've sort of got 15 to 20 that you're keeping, you really do just have to sit down and look at the other 9 coaches or 11 coaches or however many coaches in your league and just have a look at how they stack up and how you stack up. Again, we're projecting. We know, like any format of fantasy, there's going to be some variance there, but I think you can get a pretty good idea by doing that. Often there's 2 or 3 teams that have probably, stockpiled some youth. Those teams often stand out pretty quick when you're going through. They probably don't have those 100-plus midfielders. They don't have probably many 90-plus, but you can sort of see them coming down the road. When they've got multiple top 5 picks from recent drafts in their team, they probably gave away a good player to get a first-round pick back in. So I think you really do have to study it, and that's where I think you can sort of spend those quiet months of October, November, December. Just have a look through. There's not going to be much change in a lot of teams, and you do have to just get a bit of an understanding of where you stack up. After that, though, when you're preparing for the redraft, that is when it does get a little tricky. Once you see the pool of players that are available, depending again on the league size, we know the rookies, those top talents go, and we will touch on that at the end of the podcast. But after that, Jordox, it's just tricky to know who's going to come on because there's not a lot of real quality talent there if you've got 15 keepers minimum that's been held.
That's right. It depends when you do your redraft too. Like I know in the ones I'm in, we do it sort of early Feb. So much changes between early Feb and round 1, as we know. I guess the other question too is if, say you go into a season with one idea of where your team's at and what you could likely achieve, say you go in thinking, I could win the flag this year, and you get to the halfway point, you've had some injuries, some of the guys you thought would jump up haven't really popped. Can you sort of pivot your strategy mid-season and say, well, the writing's on the wall, this isn't going to be my year. I do now need to just look at the next few years. And then on the flip of that, it may be a case where you think you're not going to contend. It's going to be another year where you're just, building these young guys, and you have 2 or 3 guys that just pop and just go bang. And all of a sudden, you're a chance to play finals halfway through. Do you then pivot, or do you stick with the long-term plan, or is it just a case-by-case sort of scenario?
Yeah, to me, I always prefer that approach of get into the season, because really with fantasy, you just have to make finals. Like, so much changes in that back end of the season. Some guys get put in for surgery. Some guys do get those role changes that you thought they were an average player. But for the last 3 weeks of the season, for the fantasy finals, they're superstars. So I always like to go in, unless you're really, if you are that youthful team, right? If you're fielding and stockpiling all these rookies, you probably stick to that plan. But if you even think you're a slither of a chance, let the season play out. Let a few games go by, see who kicks on. Because I always find a lot of teams have a trade deadline probably around 15, 16, maybe as late as 18. That's pretty late in the season for a trade, but let it get to that point, because also that's when your trade value of these players are often at their highest. If you've got older guys, hard to trade them this time of year. People go, oh, what if they have a role change? They're so old. What if they want to retire? Whereas you get to around 18, you see them averaging 95, and the person goes, gee, I don't mind giving up a kid here for an extra 20 points in that line of an upgrade. So for me, I always like to let the year play out, see how you go, and then pivot mid-season or around that trade deadline and clear out the old guys if you're rebuilding, or conversely, if you've got a couple of young guys that you think you can spare and getting older guys is going to put you over the top, I'm all for it. I think that's where playing in a cash league, Jordox, makes that call a little bit easier. When you're playing just sort of for fun, it's really hard to let the young guys go because you want to watch them for the career. Whereas if you've got sort of a carrot there and you're sort of, I guess, like a footy club, like you appreciate how hard it is to win the flag, you don't mind taking those extra risks and taking those 3 old blokes that might, two might retire at the end of the year, but you're getting that upgrade in points. So for me, the pivot is definitely the way to go. See how the season plays out. See who kicks on, as you said. You might just be surprised and have a guy that you pegged as a 50 or 60 guy, especially if they're young. Role change, opportunity. Next thing you know, you're looking at a 90-plus scorer that's super, super valuable.
That's right. And it sounds like the advice really is, don't be married to the narrative of your season. It can change. Have a plan, but once you're in, yeah, like you said, anything can really happen. And particularly if you nail a really good trade where you pick up a couple of guys that just, go for it from there.
Well, that's what Jordox. That's why we love the exercise of the keeper doing the rankings every year. Is you got to expect there is going to be change. Like that's what it always teaches me and MJ is like you can't be steadfast in your ways. Like if you think there's a bankable person that's rock and rolling right now and it's the business end of the season and you need to be put over the top, do it, because the next year you might think you got a guy that's not to pick an Alex Witherden, it's an Alex Witherden, top 30, 40 prospect, got him for 10 years. And the next thing you know, footy just moves a different way and they're out of the league or they're just a really diminished asset. So I like leagues where winning the thing is really valued and sort of feels really hard to do, because I feel like that's when you get a more active league. People aren't afraid to, as I said, sell some youth to go all in, or vice versa, sell off some of the old guys and take some youth and just, live to fight another year.
Yeah, that's it. Anything can happen, so be prepared for all scenarios. Another question we got was on X from @Evans505, and it was about rucks. So we did the ruck ranking episode a couple of episodes ago where we looked at, the top ranked, but also the current ruck setups across the league. And, just speaking of things that change quickly, like even just that episode was a few weeks ago, and there's so much new info to add to it. Lockie McAndrew at the Crows getting picked up. Things change. But to the question from @Evans505, can you enter a season without a ruck? Is it too risky, or is it just safe to assume you'll be able to get one in the redraft that'll be serviceable? So obviously this isn't about, your top 6 or 7 scoring rucks of the comp. This would be maybe, I'll give you an example. In a league I'm in, someone dropped Riley O'Brien and just has entered this year without a ruck and will obviously plan to draft one. So what's your take on that? Or is it just a little bit too risky? Is the ruck line sacrosanct and you just need a body there?
No, first point of call for me is always put your players in their order in terms of most value. If you're keeping 10 people and you've somehow got Zach Merritt, Bontempelli, Dawson, Lockie Neal, Sheasel, you know what I'm getting at, Jordan. If you've just got 10 guys that are just way better value than your ruck, you work it out. Where the ruck can be a real pain in the ass for people is if you've got 10 to 12 coaches, we really know that there's 18 clubs in the comp. Some of those clubs play 2 rucks where they're averaging 50 or 60. What you don't want to get caught with is that someone takes 2 rucks. Next thing you know, you're playing a Sava Galea back in the day when he was a ruck forward at Geelong and he's averaging 35. Just so you don't have a donut. So you do have to be careful going, okay, who's the ruck I'm going to get in the pool? Who do I think I'm going to be able to get? Because in my mind, if it's anywhere close, you just don't want to open yourself up to that risk. I know I'm in a league with 16 coaches and it's dynasty. And you could imagine that if there is an injury, which happens, and you don't have the direct handcuff to that player, you're going into a matchup. You could potentially be down 110 points off the bat because you're fielding a donut. Now in keepers, it's a bit funny. Often a lot of people don't want to carry 2 rucks, depending on the bench size. You get all those sort of intricacies. But for me, you'd want to be really confident that the other players you've kept exceed the value by a long way, because just the risk of having no one, and you probably do have to sort of try to get a feel for your league, because some people, you might just have, for example, in some leagues, a Sam Draper sitting there, just sits in the waivers all year round, but it only takes a couple of injuries to rucks and they go to a dual ruck setup and then people need them. So there can be some panic where people go, you know what, I'm taking Oscar McInerney and I'm going to take Darcy Cameron. And I'm just going to match him up depending on the week. I'll pick and choose. Soldo Sweet's a cheap sort of handcuff combination a lot of people get, because you can get Sweet pretty late. Soldo's pretty cheap as well because he doesn't have a forward status. So for me, what I'm really getting at is I don't want to be left in a situation where I can't get one, or I have to pay a draft pick in the redraft to get the one I want, and I'm missing something else when I could have just kept him and taken a flyer elsewhere. You just don't want to get caught at a disadvantage where you've got no ruck, because then you're going to have to go to people going, hey, can I trade for one of your rucks? And they've sort of got you over a barrel there that you've got nothing to really negotiate. So for me, I guess long story short, yes, you can, but you'd need a very specific set of circumstances in terms of the quality of player you've got. And I guess what I'm trying to say there is if I'm going to do that, I'm probably going to, and I'm in that first example I said, where I just feel like I've got greater talent on my list. What I'm probably going to try to do then is actually move one of them for the ruck before the redraft and try to get some increased assets elsewhere. So maybe you are giving up, say, for example, let's just pick a random note. Let's say Bontempelli. You're going to give up Bont. A coach has got Tim English and he's also got Darcy Cameron. Maybe you can get, just say a Darcy Cameron, and he can give you a couple other pieces in a swap that, make it a bit more comfortable for you, because you're staring down the barrel of having to pick Sam Draper or Nick Bryan as your ruck, and you feel like you might lose 30 or 40 points. So you probably want to try to sort it out before the redraft so you've got one, because the last thing you want to be doing is just get left with a nothing, and it's so hard to find one on the waivers. You probably would have to get a Mick Andrew and pray for an O'Brien injury, or for him to take over. And I just feel like you don't want to be losing 60, 70 points minimum off the bat because you haven't addressed it. So long story short, yes, you can, but try to address it or try to manipulate your keepers in a way that you can address it with the coach that's got probably two of them, because there will be a coach. If you don't have one that you want to keep, someone's probably got two. And unless they've got the utility on in the league, they're not really getting great value for having that good asset on the bench. So you might just better find a bit of a win-win.
Yeah, you can definitely do it, like you said, but it's not for the faint-hearted. And yeah, like you said, you got to be well prepared. Have a strategy. When are you going to get that ruck?
Yeah,
back
10 teams. Jordox makes me a bit more comfortable. Once I start getting above 12, because you're already probably thinking, okay, if there's probably 10 good ones, someone's probably not afraid to grab a second just as a backup or as a loophole. In some leagues you can easily do that, where you just one ruck plays early, E on them, good score, put a donut on, bad score, put the second ruck on. So you just don't want to get caught where a couple of teams take two solid ones, and I'm talking about that, maybe the Jordan Sweets, their second, and you're thinking, damn, I thought they'd slide to me. And next thing you know, you're grabbing Reece Stanley, Toby Conway. You can't even play Sam de Koning there yet. You're doing all those things where you're just relying on circumstance. So I don't love it just because, the upside downside of it, but it's probably small league, small keepers. I'd feel more comfortable. Bigger league, 12 plus with 15, 20 keepers. Just don't like the risk of getting caught with your pants down and having a zero in that position that you can't address.
That's right. If you're going to do it, be prepared to jump early in that redraft. And if you get too cute, you may end up with nothing. And don't underestimate how
savvy coaches too.
Well, savvy and vindictive coaches can be.
Yeah.
Like someone will grab it because they know that that's what you need. So, that's good. That is a great question, and I think a lot of us have faced it over the years. Unless you've got one of the top rucks, and like you said, the less keepers it is, more viable. But some good stuff there. And then the last question we'll sort of run through is from @MP Punchy on X. And the question here was around delistings. So I guess, Kane, how do you decide your final few keepers? Because the first, 8 or 10 or whatever it is, probably are pretty easy. But that last 2 or 3, they're always really hard. Is it about trying to preempt what your opposition coaches are going to do in the redraft, or is it a case of balancing? This guy will help me next year, but not beyond. Whereas this guy probably won't help me next year, but he's a long-term guy. All those variables go up in the air. So how do you sort of land on your final few keepers every year?
It is funny, Jordox, isn't it? Because you always seem to have, if you got 20 keepers, first 16 are easy. Last 4, you got 8 guys you're trying to work out. I think the thing naturally in keepers that we do is we do probably hold on to those older guys often a little bit longer just because we feel like they're safe scorers. Whereas for me, I feel like if you're going to win it, as good as a 75 or a low 80s defender sort of is, or, a 70s forward or a mid 80s mid is good. The players that really win it for you are the ones that can jump and be 100 plus mid, 90 plus defender, 90 plus forward. So I'm really reticent to get rid of quality talent, especially if they're on the younger end, even if they haven't proven it. I'd rather hold on to them and give them a few extra years to prove it and let some of those older guys go. So naturally, if I sort of get to that last few spots and I've got a couple of older guys that I think are plug and play versus youth that I sort of think in a year or two could pop, I always go the youth. I think I can always find someone that's close enough in that sort of plug and play level. If you've got too many good players, you're going to have to work the phone and upgrade again. If you've got two guys that you're dropping that you know are going to go in the first round of the redraft because they're just too good of players, package them up, try to get an upgrade somewhere else, and climb those tiers that me and MJ list in the keeper list. Don't just be throwing players back. Get an upgrade somewhere. Even if you take your 6th round pick to a 3rd round pick, you've probably got to get into that 3rd round because, as you know, Jordox, and I've found it in the last few weeks as I've been redrafted, I look at the same players in the 4th round that I look in the 9th round. Like it's such a congested pack of players. I don't feel any better or worse. I know I'm throwing darts. So for me, I want to hold on to that youth a little bit more. Again, the more keepers you got, the easier it is to hold youth. The less quality older players there is in the pool, though, and then conversely, the less keepers you have, you're throwing back better talent, and it's a bit tricky to hold youth. But I'm always of the mindset of, if this guy I believe can get to be a premium in their line, I've got to prioritise that because they're the ones that are going to get me to win the league. You don't want to just be meandering with average talent. It can change so quick now. And I feel like these draftees are better prepared than ever before. That 3rd year, 4th year breakout we used to look at, we're seeing more and more not only doing it in their 2nd year, but doing it off the bat and being really viable guys, especially in the second half of the season. So for me, I'm not too worried about preempting, just because there's another 9 to 11 to 13 coaches doing their own thing. I'm more just looking, who are the ones that I think can help me a bit this year, but I never want to be sacrificing a stud to keep someone that's going to help me this year. I'd rather keep the stud younger player, even if they haven't shown anything, and work it out, because you often do find that, especially if you're 32 plus, a Dangerfield goes late, a Pendlebury goes late, a Mitch Duncan side bottom, and you look at their average and you go, oh, it's not that great. But often you dig a little bit deeper and you go, well, they were the sub that game, or they got rested that game. Like, you actually start looking a bit deeper at the average. They're probably giving you 5 to 10 points more than the average actually suggests. And no one's going to touch them in the redraft because they're old and they're not really a value outside of the season. So I'd rather be the guy that keeps my good young talent and takes those sort of older guys that fill the void, combined with the youth, and just cycle it through there. Because the other thing in a keeper is, you really have to get comfortable letting someone go and reacting to the waiver pool, because this game just changes. And if you're just stuck on who you drafted, you can miss gold.
Yeah, I reckon I spend a lot of time, because we do the leagues I'm in, we do delistings quite early, like in October. So, and I like it that way because we do it before DPPs are announced. We do it after the AFL trade period so we can see if players have found new homes. But I love doing it before the preseason and the summer because, so much changes. It just makes that redraft pool even more appealing once February, March rolls around. But I guess it depends too on the league you're in and who you're playing with. Like, I'm in one where it's with pretty close mates and there's 8 coaches. So it's an 8-team league. And when I get down to my last 2 or 3, I'm looking at who can I be pretty comfortable knowing I could get him back in the redraft before someone else. So I look at the other teams, what their needs are, what they're likely doing, who are they going to delist, what are their priorities going to be. And then, 4 or 5 months later, it could all turn around and, completely change. But yeah, it's interesting. So I think for a more intimate league where you know exactly who you're up against, you can probably do a bit more preempting. But to your point and the way you play it, it's pretty smart to just head down, look at your own squad, look at what you're going to get from those players moving forward, and make the call based on that. But it's so hard, isn't it? Delisting. It's one of the hardest parts of being a keeper league coach, because
you can feel sick. You can feel sick to
some of these guys.
Let that guy go.
Yeah. Yeah, and someone else picks them up the next year and off they go. And I know we've all got a heartbreak story. I had this guy for years, finally let him go. And then, my rival picked him up and he's laughing all the way to the bank. So, yeah, there's a lot of decisions. There's a lot that has to be considered when you're making those decisions. And I guess the other bit of advice, would be, end of the day, don't beat yourself up if you do drop someone who goes on with it, because none of us have crystal balls. We just make calls based on the evidence that's in front of us at the time.
Yeah, that's 100% right, Josh. You can't get too hung up. You had to make a call. Again, you've got a deadline for a reason. I haven't been in the league as early as you, but I do love that it's like, this is in October. It's basically everyone's doing their own research at that point, because we know it's rest time for the fantasy community in October. You're not getting any fresh content except me and MJ doing keeper league tiers as absolute sickos. But other than that, you're not really getting much talk about the sort of minutiae. Whereas, Feb 1 redraft compared to end of Feb, when you've seen some scratch matches. Like, in a week, if we did this, could you imagine how different redraft's going to be when we've seen these official practice games? Like, it just changes, and guys get put up in lights, and let alone 4 or 5 weeks into the season. So you can't get hung up. They are hard calls, and often they're sort of 50-50 coin flips where, like the salary cap game. Hey, Jordox, I was going to field him, but I'd put the loophole on him. Like, it's the game. Sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't. The little nugget I will say, which you can sort of do sort of end of season, is I'm a big fan, especially if you're out of the mix, but I think you can do it in contention too. You get to the end of the season, you sort of know who you're playing on field. You know that guy's your first emergency you're going to have a look at. And sometimes you can be left with 5 to 7 guys that realistically, at that point of the year, they don't have a role for you. So that's the time of year I love to list those 5 or 6 guys, go through the waiver pool. If there is any buzz on a young player that might get a new home, now this is a guy that hasn't landed a new home, but he's a guy that I picked up the last 3 years, Dev Robinson. You hear that VFL scorer, always linked to West Coast, and I go, that's a good opportunity. I just pick him up, and I pick those types of players up that have scoring pedigree, all those sorts of things. And I just stash them, because by the time it gets to February 15 and I've got to finally make those cuts, something might have changed. He might have got a new preseason role. He might have got a trade. So I think in August, you can be a bit cheeky and start cutting a lot of those guys you're not going to keep. And they're probably guys, hey, Jordox, that they're just going to be a plug-and-play guy. They're 70, 75. They're in their late 20s, early 30s. Yeah, they're a nice asset, but really they're not getting a run in your team in the back half of the year. Get rid of them and throw some darts at some guys, especially if they've got some draft capital behind them from their club. If they're a top 15, 20 pick from the previous draft, they haven't played, but they've got some good VFL or waffle or sample numbers behind them. I love that, especially this day and age with how quickly these kids come on. Grab them, stash 5 or 6 of them. Stash as many of them as you can that you don't need to play on field. Grab them all. Let the off-season run its course. And then by the time it gets to February, you might just have 1 or 2 nuggets that actually do make you keepers that you never thought would, because they've had a preseason role change. I was telling you before, after Nazai Wanganeen-Miller's first year, he was back in the pool late in the season because he's a mid. He's not averaging overly great. He's not really a fieldable guy. You probably can't see him at that point being a keeper for a team in the league settings we had. But I just thought, you know what? I've got people that I'm never going to play. I've got a Cam Guthrie who's injured, or whatever. I'm just going to grab Nazai Wanganeen-Miller. I don't know if I'll keep him, but I'll worry about that in 5 months. And next thing you know, there's some buzz in the preseason. He's got a halfback role, and fast forward, he's one of the best draft prospects we have, and he was a 90 guy that year. So that's just a little nugget for the listeners. In that back end, even if you're out of it, go through that waiver pool. Anyone young, talented, look at state league numbers. and just stash them instead of those guys that you know are going to be, yeah, they're good, they're decent, but they're just sort of what they are, right, Jordox? There's no upside or boom there.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think the point you made about how early these rookies are coming on now, it's to the point where if they don't pop in their second or third year, we do kind of feel like, oh, it's not going to happen, and we give up. I'm really big on finding those guys that others have given up on. Like a Bailey Humphrey is an example who, you know, I remember thinking, looking at him in preseason thinking, oh, nah, I don't know if he's ever going to make it. And it's like, no, hold on. That was his second year. Like, calm down. So I think we write them off pretty quickly because we've seen so many guys like Dacos and Sheasel as the extreme examples who just go bang from the moment they arrive. So it's great advice, Kane, to look at the end of the year, see who people have given up on, who's available, just grab them all and then see what happens, 4 or 5 months later. It's great advice. And I'll move on from the questions. Thanks to those that put in the questions. I mean, that's some really good conversation starters, and thanks, Kane, for your thoughts. Some really good advice in there from yourself. Before we finish, and I'll let you go because I would love to have you for hours and hours and hours, but I do appreciate your time. The rookies, all right? So, finders keepers has hit the ground with some positional rankings, and I've seen a few comments saying, where are the rookie rankings? Where are the rookie rankings? So I thought
it's
I'd
the most
do it a little
exciting
bit
part of the
differently.
whole game, isn't it, Jordox?
Yeah,
Kids,
I know.
When we say redraft, what people really mean, and you know this having actually done redraft rankings, what the people really want. I've got a first round pick. Who am I spending it on? Who is the next Caleb Sarong, Harry Sheasel, Dacos? Who are these guys that I can find, be my new love child? I've got them for the rest of their career. They're never playing for another club. They play for Jordox FC. I don't know your team name, but you just keep them.
I like that.
And it is a hard list because, draft pick order they get selected is, often weighs heavy on a lot of people. But I think, I do personally love digging into them, trying to get a bit of an understanding on where they fit. And it is amazing after a year or so. I even think back to last year. Darcy Wilson was a guy I just loved with the fit, and I couldn't believe he was going outside the top 10. But he's picked as a late teen selection. But the best bit is just once you see them play, all of a sudden a year on, you'd completely do that draft order differently if you were redrafting for a keeper of that draft class last year. So it's the best part of the game, honestly.
It is, and what we've put together is actually. So we've had Keeper Fantasy up and running, the new format, which is brilliant and absolutely where you should be doing your drafts, Keeper or single season, and Dynasty as well, of course. So that's been open for a few weeks now. So I've been able to get my hands on some interesting data about ADPs. So the ADP is your average draft position. And what I've been able to get is the top 10 ADPs for the rookies. So this top 10 is based on what you, the listener, and those out there drafting have done. So I'll run through them, Kane, and then I'll come to you and ask you any surprises, and then maybe get you to give us your top 10, and we'll see how they marry up. Now, obviously, I have to preface this with this was done before Jagger Smith's unfortunate ACL injury was announced. So keep that in mind. And we will talk about him at the very end as well, because there's a lot of questions that have come through what to do there. So let's have a look at it. The top 10 ADP on Keeper Fantasy so far for your redrafts. In at number 1, no surprises, has been Jagger Smith. After him, we have Levi Ashcroft, also probably no surprises. Number 3 is where it gets a little bit interesting. Sam Lawler has been coming in at number 3, and I'll get your thoughts on that shortly, Kane. Number 4, a boy right next to my heart, Sid Draper. Haven't been able to snag him in any drafts, unfortunately, but as a Crows man, I'm pumped for him. Number 5, Harvey Langford. And then we go on to Josh Smiley at number 6 for Richmond. Number 7, you've got Finn O'Sullivan. Number 8 is Toby Travalia, which is the first player who doesn't just have mid status. Number 9 is interesting, Bo Allen, also with defender status, mid defender from West Coast. And then rounding out the top 10 is the other demon alongside Langford in Xavier Lindsay. So I guess there's a couple that sort of stick out to me before we get to your 10, Kane. Thoughts on where that's landed? Any names that were a bit maybe in a different order than what you'd expect?
Yeah, different order than I would go. I think that's pretty right in terms of what I would expect the public to go, mainly because Lawler's the number 1 pick. Often hard for people to slide him down. He's got some good numbers behind him, especially for the way he plays. You think he's going to have forward status a lot of the early part of his career, and obviously a massive talent. I think all the names you listed are the names that are in and around the mix. For me, I've got a different order, which I'm happy to reveal whenever you want me to. But I think for the most part, that's right. Yeah, it's a funny bunch though, isn't it? Because they're all midfielders, really. It's just that type of draft class where they're really just all mids. Even Travalia, like he's sort of been comped as a Will Day type. So yes, he's likely to start his career in defence like Will Day did, but even he's got prospects with his sort of size and frame and skill set that he could even progress to be a midfielder one day, which is really, really fascinating, especially with the club he's at, St Kilda, sort of needing that type, and at 188 centimetres, who knows? So yeah, talented bunch, a lot of mids, which I think makes it a really exciting keeper class. I think that's the ones that really jumped out to people.
And I think compared to other years anyway, there's not a lot with there's almost none with forward status, certainly none in that 10, but there's not a lot with the DPP. A lot of them are just pure mids. So it's not a surprise that most of that list is pure mids. I'm with you. I think Lawler at 3 is probably a touch earlier than what I would have expected. But in saying that, the power of the number 1 pick, he's the marquee player. He's going to be the poster boy at Richmond for many years. He's the next Dusty, that some have said. So I guess not that surprising. A lot of people would have just deferred to him, particularly if you're a Richmond fan and you've got a pick in the top 5. I mean, why wouldn't you? So all great names, all are going to do really well, I'm sure. But Kane, when you run us through, if it were up to you, who would be your top 10? And
where do you want me to start, Jordox? From 10 or from 1?
I reckon start at number 1, and this is with the info that you have, which is obviously that Jagger Smith will be missing 2025. But take us from number 1 through to 10.
Number 1, now I had these guys 1A, 1B. Again, depending which side of the bed I wake up on, I had them 1A and 1B. I've got them 1 and 2 now, for obvious reasons to be revealed. But Levi Ashcroft's number 1. Again, I don't know what more you want in a prospect. He's just an absolute ball magnet winner at a club he's already got a bit of a connection with, having spent some time there and obviously been a father-son. So in terms of integrating into an AFL environment, I don't know if there is a better pathway than what Levi Ashcroft's got. Yes, he'll have to be a little bit patient in terms of absorbing a plum centre bounce role, but look at the age of Neil, look at the age of a Josh Dunkley. Like in 2 or 3 years' time, this guy's going to be in his prime and likely that pure centre bounce midfielder that's just an absolute beast. Also ridiculous that if he was born 2 weeks later, he's not even eligible in this draft. Like he's nearly as young as you can get for his draft age. So to be considered, the best prospect in the draft and to nearly be too young for it, I just think this is a guy we're going to love for a long time.
Didn't Fagan say if he was eligible, he would have played him in the finals last year as well?
Yeah, I believe he did. He had a game for them last year. I'd have to double check exactly what his numbers were, but I thought he walked in and had over 30 touches. Let me just pull it up and have a look. Yeah, he played for their VFL team and just had the lazy 35 touches, 8 marks, 5 tackles, and 145 fantasy points. Jordox as a 17-year-old.
Yeah,
he's not even
incredible.
18 at that point. So yeah, this guy's as good as you can have a draft profile, and I'm a big guy for pedigree and junior numbers, particularly when they combine the junior numbers with their draft position in terms of being a high pick. So love Levi. Still love Jagger Smith. Got him 2 overall. Doesn't bother me much at all. Like I would have loved to play him on the field if I had him, and I think he would have been fieldable as sort of an 80 average guy this year at Carlton. That was sort of my expectation for him, which is a blow, but it's not much of a blow that makes me go and pick someone else. I still got him at 2 overall. It's a keeper league. You've got him forever, unless you've got some minuscule amount of keepers. But even still, even if you were keeping 8, like I've probably got him close to the best 80 prospects anyway. So I still think he'd probably make my list unless I was absolutely stacked. So I know for a lot of people, he will not go at 2. People get scared off. You're not getting to see him play. What happens if he doesn't recover from the knee? I look at Will Ashcroft.
Well, maybe he did. Hold that thought. We'll come back to Jagger at the end.
Perfect.
Because we've got some questions about what to do there. So you've gone Ashcroft into Smith, still got him at 2, even with the 12 months off, which speaks to how exciting he is as a prospect. Who have you got at number 3?
So I've got a little tier gap here. So I've got the top 2 in their own little class. Number 3, I've got Harvey Langford from Melbourne. Again, just the way this kid came on, prototypical midfielder, absolute bull. Already got some forward craft to him. Again, just the club situation as well. Viney's age, question marks on Oliver and Petrarca. And also I think they probably just need someone like that. So to get him, local kid, just ticks a lot of boxes for me. Jordox with not only his scoring, Lark medalist, but dominated juniors, clear pathway for me as he grows and develops, and a very different player to what they've sort of got coming through with, the likes of Trent Rivers. They've spoken about putting McVee through the midfield. We know Wins is a bit of an outside dasher. So to have a genuine bull that's 18 years old with the older guys, I think it's just perfect timing. Number 4, I've got Xavier Lindsay. So 2 Ds in the top 4. Just the skill set. Like this guy's super, super classy. Love the way he uses the ball. It feels like Melbourne need that player. They really miss Salem when he's been out because he's not a long penetrating kick, but really decisive, can hit that sort of inside 45 kick that can unlock the ground. So I just feel like with Lindsay's traits, there's a role there, and I could see him being eased into it at halfback, and I don't think there's a more lucrative role in football than halfback. And I think Melbourne need that. If Melbourne need that, if they're gonna put Rivers into the midfield, if they've got aspirations for even Judd McVee to spend some time there with his run and carry. Jake Bowie's been a good player, but he probably hasn't kicked on as much as we thought. So it just feels like there's a big opportunity there in a team that's sort of regenerating on the go. Number 5, your man, Sid Draper. Love the fit, local talent, got a lot of the traits. Not so much, obviously, the ball winning of an Ashcroft and a Smith, but feels like, if people get what they'd obviously dream for with him, he's probably some sort of Butters Rosie hybrid, really. Just that speed, agility, evasiveness.
I'll take that.
And I feel like those type of guys, naturally you want the ball in their hands. They can win it themselves. They sort of end up being 100 averaging midfielders. So big Sid Draper fan. Number 6, Toby Travalia. St Kilda's been really good with their first few picks. Jordox, I look back the last 3 years. Darcy Wilson, Filippo, Wanganeen Miller. They've obviously got some types they're looking for that fit the Ross system. And you look at this guy, scorer, again, 188. As I said, those Will Day comparisons. I just like the system, the fit, the profile. Start him halfback. Could keep him there, could bring him into the midfield. And you get a defender now. And I probably think of almost this group outside of Ashcroft. I'd almost have Toby pegged to be the second highest average. Oh, that just wouldn't shock me. Now, he might not get there, but Riley Bonner scored pretty well in this system. And I think Toby's at that level.
Do you mean in his first season or overall?
No, in his first season. I think when you look forward, Smith, Langford, Toby's probably getting to that level with Lindsay and Draper, where they're probably more the low 100 guys, where I think I think Ashcroft and Smith have that 115. Like they generally have potential to be just incredible. But yeah, Toby this year, if he was second out of this group behind Ashcroft, that would not surprise me at all. Finn O'Sullivan 7. Hard player to read, hard club, so many mids. I like him a bit more. Again, it's funny because North could have obviously gone Smith. They had that option. They didn't go there. Doesn't have junior numbers, but he's got so many injuries already, like sort of in his background. Like this is the guy that everyone thought would be one, and it's just hasn't sort of happened for him. So that just worries me a little bit just because there's so many and so various injuries, which is a little bit like what they had with Wardlaw as well when they drafted him. Just a few injuries that hang around. And I just feel like if they do sign LDU, Shees was in there. It's just the mouths to feed. And he can also play wing, which is an important role, but it feels like it might be like another Finn Callahan, where it might just take sort of to that 4th or 5th year before we really see him scoring big. And then 8th and sort of the last guy in this tier is Sam Lawler. Again, number 1 pick at Richmond. It's going to take some time. And just his play style, sort of that big body, strong, a solid scorer, but also solid sort of when you're the best player in the country, you sort of should be averaging 90, and that's what he averages at a state league level. He hasn't sort of shown those big numbers like a Smith or an Ashcroft or a Langford. So I think he's good, but I think he's probably going to be a mid-forward for at least the sort of first 3 to 4 years as he sort of gets that AFL body and finds a role as Richmond build out their team. And the last couple, Josh Smiley, Richmond teammate, this doesn't even look like a midfielder at 195 centimetres. Sort of that Cripps physique, almost Bontempelli with just that kicking power. Now, obviously, we know Bont is, in my opinion, the best player in the comp, and that leg and that combination of all the tools Bontempelli has is the best. But if you're just looking at sort of the physical traits that he's got, Smiley, like you can see why people would hope that he would be their Dawson Bontempelli, big in the air, big kick, contested, can use his body to get out of traffic. So, it's just a fit with Richmond with time. And the last one I've got is Murphy Reid, which is a bit of a different one, but I don't know, there's just something about him that I just really, really like. I like the speed. I like the smarts with the ball. My hesitation there is obviously Sarong and Brayshaw and Young. So in terms of where does he find a role, because, those guys aren't old, Jordox. Like they're still, even at their oldest, like Andy Brayshaw was born in 1999. Like he's 26 this year. Sarong and Young are born in 2001. So, you're probably hoping he's a really quality half forward with some pace, and maybe he gets that sort of 30% centre bounce in time. But yeah, just something about him I really, really like, and I just think he's got the traits. A couple of apologies would be Bo Allen, and Taj Houghton is one on pedigree that jumps off the page. Again, he's also off an ACL, so I just think they're going to be super, super patient, Richmond, with Taj Houghton. But yeah, good draft class, interesting class. Feel great about top 6. Again, I'd put Finn and Lawler in there just because of their pedigree with draft capital, and they are solid scorers. But yeah, I really want a top 2 pick. If not, I really want the 3rd pick. And then after that, yeah, there's probably a cluster of 5 for me.
Yeah, in terms of top 10 that we've seen in recent years, and we knew this going into this year, that this draft, AFL draft, was going to be midfield heavy. And when it's midfield heavy, that means it's typically going to be fantasy friendly. And it's certainly looking that way. I think it's interesting that top 10, there's only one player different to what the ADP is suggesting. And I think that makes sense in terms of the preseason and the expectation. So you had Murphy Reid in ahead of Bo Allen. And even just in recent times, the week before last in that intra-club game, Murphy Reid was in over Erasmus and Johnson. And we're yet to see what that means for sort of round 1 conversations. But he is certainly someone that will probably get more popular as we get closer to round 1.
Well, what's funny, Jordox, as well? Just one more thing before I go. It reminded me so much of the 2019 draft class. Like I look through it now, Rowell at 1, Anderson at 2, Young at 7, Sarong at 8, Tom Green at 10, Flanders 11, Day 13. Like, we really did have high hopes. And you look at some of the guys that you'd say, in inverted commas, missed. Like Lockie Ash had glimpses, but he's just never been that prime user. Dylan Stevens at 5 was obviously the one that, from a fantasy perspective, if you went, if Rowell and Anderson were off the board like they were those years, and Sarong was often the third just with his scoring pedigree, like a lot of people were weighing up at Stevens via Hayden Young or a Tom Green or a Will Day. Like, that's where probably one of these is going to be a real fringy player. Like, even of that 10 we've listed there, that's probably the scary part, because it feels like you look at that class and you go Rowell, Anderson, Young, Sarong, Green, Flanders and Day in the top 13 picks. Pretty much all of those guys are studs. You know what I mean? And there's only a couple that were misses. You look back at that 2018 class with Walsh, Smith, Rosie, Butters, like the ones that were actually mids. You take out the Rankin, Lukosius, King twins. It's like, gee whiz, you barely missed if you got one of those guys in those years. So sometimes there's just these years that are crazy. This feels like there's some genuine talent in there. As I said, the scary part is, and just the way it works in footy, right? Like, there's going to be 2 that are just probably busts. That's just what that's what the numbers would say, whether it's injury or whether it's opportunity. That's the scary part.
And then
that's the fun part too.
And there'll be 2 or 3 that we haven't even considered who'll just pop up and become amazing as well. That's the beauty of the game. Now, before I do let you go, Kane, thank you so much for your time, but it would be remiss to not put this question to you. So you've got Jagger Smith at 2, even after the unfortunate news from the other week. So I guess that's probably going to give a bit of a clue to what your thoughts are going to be. But if you're a keeper coach now heading into your draft with pick 1, are you still going to grab Jagger if you had your heart set on him? And then on the flip of that, a lot of redrafts have already happened, and there's a lot of people who took him at number 1, and they're now sitting there thinking, do I sit on him for 12 months or do I look at trading to another one of these top 10 guys and maybe something else? And I guess it depends where that coach is and where their club is. But just a quick thought on Jagger Smith and the value of keeping him and whether he's still worth the high-end pick.
Yeah, well, for me, he's Will Ashcroft if the knee happened in the preseason. That's how I'm judging him in my own eyes. You know, Will Ashcroft obviously went down his first year. He was averaging about 80, showed us everything and more that we thought he would as a first-year player. So for me, that's how I see Jagger Smith. Yes, you're not reaping the benefits of that solid season. Yes, year 2 might take him some time to get up to speed, but like, this is as pure a fantasy ball winner as you're going to see. And often these types that we see, Dane Swan, super late pick. Gary Ablett Jr., one of the greatest players of all time. Tom Mitchell, later pick, father-son, later. Like, you've got unbelievable ball-winning junior numbers combined with the 3rd pick overall in the draft. Like, for me, this is where it feels can't miss. The knee is super unfortunate. The only player I'd consider jumping over him is Harvey Langford, but I can't do that with the team he's going to. He's going to a team that, yes, has Cripps. Then it's got Walsh and Chera. We know both of them, unfortunately, have been injury-riddled. And then their 4th midfielder, who's really, really serviceable, is a George Hewitt, who we know in the right role can be a bloody good scorer. But my point there is the stars are aligning that in 24 months, you would not be surprised if this guy is the centre bounce guy for Carlton, supported by Walsh alongside a chair if they stay fit. But I just have the highest hopes that this guy is going to be a 105, 110. And that's what you're looking for in keeper leagues for me. You want to win. You need guys that can separate. Unfortunately, guys that get caught in the 85, 90 range, 95 range that are really good players, great. But it's the 105, 110, Tom Mitchell, 120 plus guys that give you an edge. You can find your sort of older veterans and get them pretty cheap and be 80, 85 and serviceable. the players that win it for you are the separators. And I just think Ashcroft and Smith are going to have 110, 115 averages in their career at some point and be perennial triple figure guys. So for me, take Ashcroft first, take Jagger second. It's a keeper league. You're sitting on it. You probably weren't expecting Jagger to be much more than your fifth mid at best. More likely sixth or seventh.
It's good advice, and it's something that we can lose sight of in keeper leagues. It is a long game, and as much as it sucks that yes, you won't get to see your prize recruit this year, just think to Thursday night, round 1, 2026, Jagger Smith. You've been sitting on him for 12 months, and you get to see him up against Richmond. It'll be a moment to savour. So certainly those who got him, don't fret. We've seen what Will Ashcroft did, like you said, Kane.
Petrarca was the same, Jordox.
Yeah, that's right. But to come back in and win a Norm Smith medal was incredible.
Yeah.
Actually, Petrarca won a Norm Smith a few years later as well. Yeah. So there you go. Kane, that's it, mate. We've absolutely loved having you on as the first ever guest on Finders Keepers. If we have any success, maybe that'll be a trivia question one day. Probably not. Thanks again, mate. I really appreciate your time and your support for the pod, and always enjoy sharing a mic with you on Coach's Panel, and we'll certainly get you back on here another time in the future.
Well done, Jordox. Keep it going, mate. Looking forward to seeing where it goes from here, especially once the season gets started and the fun really kicks in and we can be proven so wrong.
Absolutely. And speaking of the season, can you believe this week is opening round? It's here. So next week on Finders Keepers, we're going to have a look at, we're going to review the round that was opening round and have a bit of a look at if anything's changed heading into round 1, and certainly have a look at any players that have popped that may just be sitting on the waiver wire and you should be targeting. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please like and subscribe. Give us a nice review if you feel so inclined, wherever you're listening. And stay tuned for the next episode next Monday. And you can find us on X at FindKeepAFL. Do jump on and leave any feedback you have, any thoughts, ideas for the show, because the more I hear from the listeners, the more I can build the show to be exactly what you want it to be. So we'll see you again next week on Monday with the next episode of Finders Keepers, reviewing opening round. But in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.